So let's talk about the strongest and mightiest warriors of the Adeptus Astartes, and which units are likely to be left back in the battle barge. Today we're going to do a tier list of all the Codex Space Marine datasheets. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and with Arcs of Omen providing a massive shake-up to Warhammer 40k in general, I thought it was high time to do a new Space Marine tier list, talking about which units are doing best and worst in-game at the moment. Arcs of Omen really has turned the Space Marine army on its head somewhat. Loads of free war gear was handed out, Armour of Contempt went away, which shook things up some more, and there's a whole new force organisation chart to fill with units. Obviously which units are stronger will vary a fair bit chapter to chapter. Shooting chapters will usually do better with ranged units, whereas combat chapters will do better with melee, and plenty of rules just work out pretty well with one army or another. For this one though, we're going to mainly base it on raw datasheet strength in my opinion, and we are going to go through all the units in the actual Codex Space Marines as opposed to chapter specific stuff or too much Forge World stuff, though I will do just a couple of the more relevant Forge World datasheets. For the list, I've ranked the Space Marine units into 4 different tiers, trying to split down the first and second ones for a little bit more granularity. We'll talk through each unit and what they bring, and why they're doing well or not getting taken so much in current 40k. Starting off with tier 4, here are some of the weakest units in Codex Space Marines right now, at least in my opinion. First up, we've got the Space Marine Flyers, the Storm Raven, Stormhawk and Storm Talon gunships. This trio weren't doing particularly well before the update, and then Games Workshop just hit Flyers with another massive nerf when Arcs of Omen dropped, making them have to stay off the board and not come in until turn 2. It kind of defeats one of the biggest points of having Flyers in the first place, to be able to zoom over and get line of sight and alpha strike things, and it's particularly bad for the Storm Raven not being able to get their units out of it until turn 3 at the earliest. If they were crazily strong damage for their points, they might be worth considering, but with Strategic Reserve being an option for everything now, you may as well have something that's super efficient in terms of damage but needs delivery because it's got slow movement, say something like Eradicators, who can use the Beta Strike to get close to the enemy. Games Workshop hasn't done too well with Firewall rules recently, and I don't think that these guys are going to be taken all that much. Next up, we've got the Scout Bike Squad, a rather fragile biker unit. These ones, they only have 2 wounds and a 4+ save, and just really don't offer that much to compensate themselves for the loss of the 3+ save and 3 wounds that standard Space Marine bikers get. They get a little bit more volume fire with their shotguns plus bolters, but the regular bikers get special weapons and things. Realistically, for the same cost, these guys are pretty much worse in my opinion. Land Raiders are still very much struggling for Codex Space Marines. They lost Armour of Contempt, which was really quite a big deal for them with their 2+ save. They were actually getting somewhat durable before. All they got in return was a few free war gear bits, which isn't really enough to compensate, and they're still struggling with the issues that Land Raiders have had all edition. They're costly and they don't have much speed. They need to invest in guns that can easily get locked up if you do rumble them forward as transports, and they don't even have the dubious honour of being toughness 9 like the Chaos and the World Eaters ones. Land Raiders just really haven't had a lot of luck for a good long time. Finally, for units that just feel directly outclassed or very underwhelming comparatively, we have the Hunter and Stalker. These guys are the dedicated Space Marine anti-air vehicles, and are kind of okay at it, but really not that impressive damage-wise against the mass majority of the field, and aircraft really aren't popular at the moment. These two just aren't really particularly strong on any level, and even if aircraft are on the field, I still think that they're only kind of passable, and probably not worth it compared with other anti-tank weapons that'll deal damage to them just as well. Moving onwards and upwards though, here in tier 3 we've got units that I think are generally kind of overshadowed, but I feel like in the right list, or if you want to try and build around them, they can be made to do quite well, or do well in certain chapters. First up, we've got the Ancient and the Blade Guard Ancient, which I feel are in kind of an unusual place. They mainly do 2 things with the fight or shoots in death mechanic, which isn't super useful in 9th edition in my opinion. I guess not awful though if you're covering something like multiple units of Devastators perhaps. The other option that they can get is getting a Chapter Ancient upgrade for a +1 to hit in combat for 1 unit, but I'd still say that's probably not quite worth it compared with other buffing characters for the most part. In reality, I generally expect Ancients to be used in just a few cases where you can get good relic banners and things, say for example the Blood Angels Sanguinary Ancient, where they have that awesome relic jump pack that makes the jump packs move quicker, and say the Dark Angels Deathwing one, where they can get the Pennant of Remembrance to give a -1 damage to one of the Deathwing units. For most chapters though, I consider the Ancients a bit of a niche choice. Next up, and probably towards the top of this tier, we have the Heavy Intercessors. These guys got a pretty enormous points cut to 23 points per model, very reasonable toughness for the cost with 3 wounds and Gravis armour, and en masse some armies will struggle to deal with that kind of profile. Their main issue is competition within the Space Marine troop slot. Heavy intercessors still seem to be taken very rarely in competitive lists compared with other choices, even after this massive points reduction. Compared with, say, infiltrators, they can sometimes be even less tough than them due to the Helix Gauntlet eating a big enemy shot each turn. And despite their strength 5 bolt rifles, the damage output is still a little bit on the so-so side. Practically, I feel like the main reason they probably don't get taken that much is just being a troop's choice that's more expensive than all the others. If you're going to hold down an objective, you usually want to be doing it with the least amount of points that you can. It does make the other troops units that are 100 points or less a bit more tempting for that. Still though, model for model, I think they're really not all that bad at all. I definitely rate them towards the top of this tier, or maybe towards the bottom of tier 2 if I was feeling generous. Sticking with the troops, we've got the Tactical Marines. They were good beneficiaries of the big free war gear handout, so you can take things like a combi melter and multi-melters plus some fancy sergeant gear now. Again, I'd rate them as usable enough for certain chapters. Salamanders will quite enjoy the melters and quite enjoy their single unit rerolls, and can be quite handy to move and shoot with no penalty for Iron Hands, for example. I'd say the problem that the tactical squad has maybe is that they just feel like they're in direct competition with things like the Devastator squad and the Sternguard veteran squad. The points difference between those two really isn't all that massive, and if you do upgrade to either of those units, then you might lose OBSEC, but you gain a phenomenal amount of extra power. Again, competitively at the moment, really not that many lists are taking tactical squads at all. They're really not that bad a deal on paper, but it seems to be that the way that most people choose to go is to have their damage dealers on defined units and then have their troops as actual dedicated objective takers, and usually that means it's helpful to have something that either forward deploys or is a bit more aggressive and can move around a bit. Still though, definitely not unusable, a fairly cheap troops choice, and one that can come with a big melter sting in the tail if you want it. Next up, we've got the Hellblasters, again remaining a bit underwhelming in my opinion. High AP plasma damage, but at a premium price at 30 points per model. I feel like they've just been a fair bit overcosted for quite a while, and the points change that they got in Arcs of Omen I think only really compensated for losing Armour of Contempt, and didn't really go over or above that. They are quite efficient at clearing out 2 wound infantry with the overcharged plasma, and perhaps be most tempted by the assault variant still, but compared with other firepower sources that do have their issues, often needing a captain to babysit them to stop them overheating and killing themselves, and perhaps the high AP that they bring just isn't quite as relevant now other armies lost Armour of Contempt as well. Definitely not unusable, but I'd still say that they're probably a touch overcosted, if not by loads. Next up, we've got the Inceptors, who briefly flew far too close to the sun and got their free plasma exterminators nerfed back to how they were. Now they've been adjusted again, they either have the option of the Assault Bolter, which is kind of lackluster damage, or the plasma exterminators, which are quite scary but makes the unit very, very expensive. And they basically lost Armour of Contempt with no points adjustment, making them worse than they were before in Nephilim. Overall, just not enormously efficient at the moment, can still be kind of interesting in armies like Dark Angels if you're not using Black Lights for the big plasma stratagem. Getting all those plasma shots up to damage 3 could potentially be worth it. The Chapter Servitors are a 4 model unit of just 4 grunts that don't really do much besides sit on objectives and do actions and things, though for that can be kind of interesting for a Space Marine army for 30 points just in itself. If you do have a spare elite slot, I don't really see these guys as being a particularly bad choice. If at any point they do say to hold an objective and allow the actual Space Marines to go out and get stuck into the enemy, then that's all going to be well and good. And if you are going to have a unit to say zone an area out to deep strike or something, then 30 points isn't the worst for that. Kind of terrible in terms of damage and defense, but if all you need is a unit to sit somewhere and not do much, then these guys will happily do that for 30 points. Moving on, we've got the Reaver squad, who now got a points reduction to be the single cheapest Space Marines in power armor at just 16 points each. An 80 point unit of these is at least kind of interesting. They can deep strike if you give them some grav shoots, and while their combat blades and pistols and carbines and things are only really good for clearing light infantry, they do have some interesting stratagems like denying OBSEC and make enemy leadership go rubbish. Still though, I'd say even for this role, I would still say that they're outcompeted at the moment. For an extra 10 points, you can get yourself a squad of Assault Marines, who actually now all their war gear free are genuinely quite threatening in combat against the field, and not just against light infantry. With an Eviscerator, a couple of plasma pistols, and some fancy gear on the Sergeant, I think that that's generally going to be worth it more than the shenanigans that the Reavers can do. Though at 80 points, I feel like using one unit if you wanted to isn't going to hamstrung your list too much. Next up, we've got the Veteran Intercessors, another unit that's kind of struggling for a role. Intercessors in the elite slot with +1 attack. In general though, I'm not sure that +1 attack is really worth the extra 2 points and the loss of Obsec over the troops version, and I feel like it would be kind of close even if they were just completely the same cost. Objective secured and the ability to take objectives and move off them are both pretty nice, and the extra attack is only really going to help so much against light infantry and things, though I guess could be interesting enough if you're trying to cram maximal value into a transport, I suppose. In general, I'd rate these as pretty much directly inferior to standard intercessors. Next up, we've got the Centurions, who I feel like were a unit that really didn't like the Armour of Contempt change. They have pretty enormous melee damage with those siege drills, genuinely quite good anti-infantry shooting at close range with the Hurricane Bolters and Flamers and things, and they can combo quite nicely with an Apothecary for some Feel No Pain and Resurrection. That's about where synergy ends though, as they don't have core, so can't use most other character boosts or stratagems. And I feel like while they had Armour of Contempt, they were genuinely quite a tough prospect to remove from the board. They now go down a bit depressingly easily for their points cost against anti-tank guns. Definitely not unusable, and if you can deliver them to their target with the siege drills, you will generally get a good result. I feel like they're perhaps kind of interesting for things like Raven Guard successors, deep striking in with a +1 to the charge, and hit the enemy in combat pretty hard. I've also chosen to rank the other flavour of Centurions down here as well. The Centurion Devastator squad with the las cannons and either missiles or hurricane bolters isn't too terrible as a bit of non-core firepower lurking in the backfield. Again though, the numbers just really don't work out amazingly well for them, to be honest. They don't compare very well with the various melter platforms that Space Marines can get quite cheaply. And again, in terms of defense, they're even more expensive than the Assault Centurions. Enemy anti-tank makes very short work of them for the points. I feel like with the new points cost as well, if you're taking anything other than the last cannons, then it's a bit of a raw deal for them, and that perhaps doesn't help synergies like all the bolter shots with Imperial Fists, for example. Definitely not unusable, but I'd argue they're not particularly standout compared with things like Eradicators or Standard Devastators. Next up, we've got the regular bike squad, 30 points per model for a trio of bikers with some special weapons thrown in. They do move pretty quickly, and they're a lot tougher than the scout squads with toughness 5 and 3 wounds. They can put out some reasonable enough close range firepower with some melters or plasmas. Again though, when everything's said and done, I still don't think that they're particularly efficient for the cost. Perhaps kind of like the Reavers, I feel like they're a bit subpar compared with Assault Marines, who do a similar job, but also threaten a good bit of melee as well as close range shooting. For other non-core firepower, the Predator tank did actually get significantly better in Arcs of Omen. It's finally enough to keep it out of the bottom tier in my opinion. For 115 points you can get a Predator Annihilator with a turret las cannon and a pair of heavy bolters. Maybe still not super exciting, but getting the sponsons free really was a big boost to these things. Should be able to chip in some reliable firepower that's fairly long range, even if they still lack the raw output that some of the other core firepower platforms can get. I'd currently put the Repulsor and the Repulsor Executioner in a similar sort of boat. Again, I would have rated these in the bottom tier before the update, but now they got an enormous points cut, they're a little bit more usable again. With all the ferocity of 9th edition anti-tank firepower, I'd still not rate them as particularly tough, but they can spit out a whole bunch of shots with all sorts of gun profiles jutting off all over them, and they are a big enough platform that it could be interesting enough to pair them with something like a Tech Marine to have them hit on twos. Again, not likely to be out damaging some of the core infantry things, but for some armies they could be a bit of a problem if they don't have enough anti-tank to put them down quickly. The Vindicator is okay as a durable enough distraction. Its raw damage output isn't terrible, but it is rather close range and very random with d6 shots. It is also annoying that it's got close range and doesn't want to be in combat unless you ruin its firepower with the blast keyword. Still though, for a threat that maybe looks a little bit more dangerous than it really is, it isn't terrible as a distraction unit. Again though, like the Predators and the Repulsors, it isn't really going to be carrying the battle line on damage terms. Moving on, we've got the Thunderfire Cannon. Space Marine Barrage Fire is particularly weak for the most part at the moment. This thing was very bad before the Barrage nerf came into effect. I'd say the only reason I'd rate it for anything is for the Tremor Shell stratagem, a 1 command point 1 to slow down a key unit in the enemy battle line. Even for this role, I think it's a bit underwhelming. I could have certainly rated it down towards the bottom of this tier or in tier 4. Next up, we've got a bunch of perhaps lesser exciting dreadnoughts. The standard dreadnought, the Ironclad, and the Contemptor. They're all iconic in their own ways, but I think they're a fair bit weaker than their competitors at the moment. For mixed role dreadnoughts, their slow movement is a bit annoying if they're a primarily melee threat. That particularly doesn't help the Ironclad. I'd say the standard Venerable Dreadnought outclasses the standard Dreadnought, and the Relic Contemptor datasheet from Forge World is probably better than the standard one from the Codex. Finally, for Tier 3, we've got the Hammer 4 Bunker, which is a bit of an awkward one to rate, to be honest. It's very, very cheap at 100 points now, down a whopping 75 points from what it was before. It isn't too terrible as a little gun turret that can potentially hit literally every unit in range, but how practical it is going to vary on the game. It may be a fairly standard tournament game of 2000 points Warhammer 40k with a lot of good terrain, it's probably not going to be worth it still. But maybe if you're playing some sort of themed mission with enormous armies on both sides and not that much terrain to hide them behind, then its heavy bolters could actually add up to a serious amount of damage. Terrain's also an issue for fortification in 9th edition, not being able to set them up too near to other terrain pieces, which can be kind of annoying. Up into units that are ranked in Tier 2 then, here we get into units that can be really quite strong in the right circumstances I think, but perhaps for the most part don't seem to get played quite as much as the stuff up in Tier 1. Just for a little bit more differentiation, I've chosen to split Tier 2 up into an upper or lower tier a little bit arbitrarily, but maybe some of the things that I'd be more inclined to rate higher out of it, and some of the ones that I maybe don't find quite as inspiring. First up, we've got the Invicta Tactical Warsuit, a forward deployment mech with an autocannon or flamer plus a bit of close combat. This thing can put some decent threat in the midfield, but is maybe a bit vulnerable if the opponent gets first turn. They might just step out and gun it down without too much trouble. Overall, for most armies, I'd rate it just a little bit underwhelming, as it depends whether you go first or not for how good it is, but the Ultramarines can have the best of both worlds with their redeployment stratagem to pull them back into their own deployment zone. Next up, we've got the Venerable Dreadnought, which I'd rank a little bit higher than the standard Dreadnought. They get 2+ to hit, and the 6+ feel no pain type rules. They can be interesting enough just as a las cannon and missile launcher turret that can walk about, plus getting some rerolls along the way. Their combat can be okay though, and the Space Wars version can get some interesting variant gear with their Blizzard Shield. For the most part, I'd still say it's outcompeted by other core firepower choices, but not too bad if you want some 48-inch range firepower. Next up at 35 points we've got the Outrider squad. These guys received a pretty decent points cut in Arcs of Omen. They're now quite a lot more tempting with their mass chainsword attacks with their thunderous charge, plus a little bit of bolter fire from those twin bolt rifles. I feel like their numbers are significantly more impressive than they used to be. They are fairly tough and do put out quite a lot of attacks, but maybe for an 135 point unit I think it's just a bit of a tall order when they're not really that good against hard targets. They're very good at deleting light infantry, but anything with significantly high saves or high toughness they are going to struggle against. Next up we've got the Fire Strike Servo Turret for 80 points. After the war gear cost changes, I'll basically always take the Las Talon. This one gets 4 shots at 24 inches, hitting on a 2+, and that is fairly efficient. It is very slow moving though, only moving 3 inches each turn on those grav plates. And while its damage output genuinely is quite good, it is competing with things like melter platforms that can get more speed and getting closer, things like eradicators, attack bikes, or land speeders. Definitely can have a role though. It could be genuinely quite punishing for enemy heavies moving into the midfield, but most lists seem to take other things. Next up, and perhaps a little bit speculatively, I've decided to rate the Desolation squad here. These guys are 35 points per model, the missiles on missile launcher marines. An interesting but maybe slightly awkward combination of barrage fire that targets infantry with direct fire that you'd usually want to target tanks with. In terms of direct damage dealing, it is perhaps some of the more efficient Space Marine barrage firepower out of the options that they have, plus it's on a core platform so you can get rerolls. I feel like these guys aren't ever really going to be played in big numbers with their enormous 35 point cost and more for that Vengor launcher, but maybe a unit of them camping on a home field objective might not be the worst, and then step forward a little bit to actually put the direct firepower to use if it's going to tip the balance at some stage. They are kind of hideously expensive for Marines that are just 2 wounds and a 3+ save though, and some lists really don't care that much about the anti-light infantry fire that they can provide. And that's why I'd rank them here. Usable, but I guess they're not going to turn into a big tournament staple that every army list has. Next up, we've got the Jump Pack Devastators that are the Primaris Suppressors. These are the ones with the 3-shot auto cannons, and are perhaps a bit better in some chapters than others. Ultramarines and Iron Hands, where they can move and shoot and not take the heavy weapon penalty, both make these guys a lot better as you use both of their best attributes. Still though, fairly weak in terms of defense, and their firepower, while okay, is a bit underwhelming against some things. Anything with either high saves, high toughness, or -1 damage isn't going to care too much. Next up we've got Terminators and Relic Terminators, Storm Bolters and Power Fists or Chain Fists, plus maybe things like Cyclone Missile Launchers. Terminators in general will definitely do a whole lot better in the Deathwing for the Dark Angels Terminators, though you'd probably want to fill them using their own datasheets rather than these ones. Realistically, I think for most Space Marine chapters, if you want to field Terminators, then the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield ones are just massively better than anything else that we can field at the moment. Really big melee power and drastically better survivability with those Storm Shields just seems pretty easy to pick up if they are going to cost the exact same amount as standard Terminators with the Power Fists and Storm Bolters. Next up, we've got the Rhino and Razorback, transport units for the Firstborn that are both kind of fine. The Razorback got a significant points decrease once more and is looking a lot more tempting. They're fairly cheap and effective for getting Space Marines into the midfield. I'd be most tempted to use them with things like either the Stern Guard Veterans or Devastators if you were going to use these rather than a drop pod. I'd say for the most part, people probably are going to want the drop pod, seeing as that gets you an Alpha Strike option. Plus, with these ones, you can't get out after you've moved. But for what they do, I think they're fairly usable. Either a Rhino that's nice and cheap, or a Razorback with the gun on top for a little bit of extra cost and sacrificing transport capacity. For assault units and things though, I feel like jump packs are probably the way to go for the most part. Next up we've got the Whirlwind, which is another interesting one to rank. Like most Space Marine artillery, it's just not very good damage output, though it can chip in occasionally if you desperately need just one model dead or something, and this is the only thing that can do it. The reason that some competitive lists pick up a Whirlwind though tends to be to use the stratagem to ignore Overwatch and make enemy units fight last. Two pretty helpful things for certain assault chapters. Maybe armies like Black Templars, Blood Angels, or White Scars all could potentially make use. I say Space Wolves perhaps have a little bit less use for them, as they've got lots of ways to hand out fights last on their unique options. Definitely paying a big premium for that role, but if it does make the difference between fighting first with two different units of Sanguinary Guard or something, and only one of them then the enemy interrupts and kills the other one, then that's going to be a massive asset to the army. Definitely could be top tier in certain armies like that if you'd like to pay the cost. Next up we've got the Impulsor, decently cheaper now at just 100 points with all the gear included. The Lethal Primaris transport zooms a unit onto an objective or into a threatening position and then you can get out after it's moved, though not charged. I'd say it's perhaps particularly interesting for the Black Templars. If they take the 5+ Invul Save Vow, then it means that you can skimp out on the Shield Dome and take something like the Missile Launcher as another threat. But overall, for the most part, I'd still say it's priced as a bit of a luxury transport for Primaris Space Marines and things, and not something that's perhaps efficient enough to spam out across the whole battle line. Can be handy to get a good staging point for something like a unit of Blade Guard Veterans or Hellblasters perhaps, or just slingshot some OBSEC units onto an objective like some Intercessors. A little bit on the niche side, though I'd argue it's a bit improved since Arcs of Omen and the points cost changes. Next up we've got the Judiciar. This is the character that hands out fights last with its nice dueling blade. That's the reason that you buy him in really, and he doesn't really do a fat lot else. Not terrible at killing some 2-wound infantry perhaps, but still not outstanding either compared with other choices. If you've got a battle line that's going to be moving forward into combat and is ground based rather than running around on jump packs or bikes or things, then it's really not too bad to have in the ranks. Pretty nice to make sure that the opponent doesn't interrupt on one of your fragile units and kill them first. He's perhaps particularly good in any armies that can get a big 6-inch heroic intervention as well, like Space Wolves. That'll allow him to get his fights last bubble active a bit better. If you can just get fights last on a warlord trait, relic or psychic power though, it might be a bit more efficient than him. Next up we've got the company champion, who's just a cheap combat character. I would basically always upgrade him to the chapter champion if I was taking one. That's easily worth it for the cost, and if you can spare command points to give him extra upgrades and things, he can get very scary indeed. Maybe combinations like the Imperium Sword Warlord trait and his own unique relic sword are both good ones that could have him striking at strength 8 and damage 3. If you can spare the command point investment, then that kind of profile is just ridiculously effective for how many points he costs. Could be nice for certain combat armies like Space Wolves or Blood Angels if you fancied fielding one. In general though, I would rate him as a bit less essential than some characters. He isn't going to give you any major buffs to your nearby infantry or anything, so could often feel a bit more lackluster compared with say a chaplain or a captain than that, who still fights kind of well. Definitely usable though. For some assault armies I'd probably rank him a bit higher than this. Next up, I thought I'd just touch on a couple of Forge World units, though I'm not doing the entire section. For the big and chunky Primaris Super Heavy, I'd also rate the Astrios in this kind of section as well. This one puts a whole load of mass and threat all in one great big tank. It's quite nice with certain chapters like the Iron Hands, where they can get a bunch of synergies on them, like the +1 to their saves from Psi Steel armor. Plus all game Devastator Doctrine and rerolls certainly help out as well. It is maybe a bit all eggs in one basket though, You might run the risk of the opponents just destroying the rest of the army and this not being enough to win the game overall. Plus, it can have some issues with terrain as well, as it's just absolutely enormous and will struggle to find places to land. I also thought I'd mention the Relic Leviathan Dreadnought as well, just as a very popular kit. The Leviathan's a fairly tanky non-core dreadnought with a 2+ armor save and plenty of wounds. I will quite like the chapters that give it all-game Devastator doctrine, particularly with things like those storm cannons for the extra AP, though probably my favourite loadout for it would be the Grav Bombards with the great big shots at damage 3. Overall, as a bit of a battle line walker with a fair bit of firepower, I think it's usable enough. For the most part, I'd say things like Redemptors and the Relic Contemptors are a bit more tempting though, as a similar kind of offering but with core, and at least compared with the Redemptor Dreadnought, the command point tax can be a little bit onerous for this one. Moving up in the world, here are the section of Tier 2 units that I'd rate as slightly higher, maybe pushing towards Tier 1, and now we're really getting to units that I wouldn't be too surprised to see in a fair amount of competitive lists. First up, I've chosen to rank the Assault Intercessors and the regular Intercessor squad here. I'd probably put them towards the top of this selection and could have been happily persuaded to put them in low tier 1 as well. These guys are the Primaris troops that hold down the battle line. The Assault Intercessors perhaps being particularly useful for moving forward, and the ones that you probably want in most combat chapters, say Blood Angels or Space Wolves and the like. They're fairly cheap and effective, can pick up a free Thunderhammer on the Sergeants, and have that useful sticky objective rule which could be kind of handy with them still getting to grips with the enemy. I feel like in current 40k though, Games Workshop might have swung the balance a little bit too far towards the way of the Phobos troops. Now troops aren't mandatory, things like forward deployment are one of the main draws to bring them, and in particular the Infiltrators do seem to be dominating the troop selection in terms of competitive lists. The Intercessors are still played, but quite a lot less in optimised armies. The same goes for the standard Intercessors really, they're nice and generalist and put out both some ranged firepower and some okay melee to bully light infantry with mass strength 4 attacks. Again, the Sergeant getting something like a Thunderhammer is genuinely quite threatening. Again, I rate these guys as a pretty solid competitive unit, probably don't want to go absolutely mad on them and mainly have them for the objective secured and things. Just for raw damage dealing, they're not quite as efficient as a lot of the elite or heavy support choices. I guess both the regular and assault intercessors do have their double shoot or double fight stratagems, they are one selling point. Next up, I've chosen to rank a couple of fast attack units here, the Storm Speeders and the Invader ATV. Again, I think that both of these are really quite solid now after the points adjustments. The Invader gets its free multi-melter, and with the last round of points cuts for the Storm Speeder, I feel like some of them are getting really quite interesting, perhaps particularly the Thunderstrike one that hits on 2s. I've chosen to rank these in tier 2, as for the most part I'd be more tempted by things like land speeders or attack bikes in the fast attack slot. Both of these are pretty efficient, but unless you're leaning into the fast attack as your primary damage dealers, it might be a bit more tempting to take other things. I've certainly seen a fair amount of Dark Angels lists that make heavy use of the Storm Speeder Thunderstrike, but they do get the Raven Wing synergies like the 5+ Invul save and things, so it might mean that they're a bit more okay to use them as mainline damaged units rather than just fast units winging around taking objectives, which most chapters would want to use them for. I feel like for that role the Storm Speeders are actually a fair bit expensive for that, when something like a cheap land speeder or attack bike might have done. They just don't seem quite as sacrificial. Another solid unit that I'd rank here are the Blade Guard Veterans, the trusty Storm Shield Primaris with Strength 5 and Damage 2 power swords, really quite a nice battle line unit, and maybe not the worst units to include if you're not really too sure what to provide a bit of melee threat with. They're fairly tanky and can be a good unit to move forward onto objectives for any assault chapters in general. I'd say perhaps they haven't been one of the biggest winners out of the whole Arcs of Omen thing. They didn't really care about armor of contempt too much in the first place with their storm shields, but then didn't get the enormous points boosts that a lot of the rest of the units in the Codex got. Overall, I'd rate them as solidly usable and rarely the worst choice in the world, but maybe not the most standout either. Next up, we've got Company Veterans, small 2-man units with some flexible war gear. For the most part, I'd probably prefer these over Servitors just for small nuisance units, as they can actually provide a little bit of threat or be somewhat tough if you give them a Storm Shield or two. Little 2-man units can be pretty handy to do objectives, do an action, or protect nearby characters. Not the worst unit to have in the army, but they're not exactly very efficient in terms of damage dealing, as they're one of the few units that didn't get their war gear free. Definitely not one to go too heavy on, but 1 or 2 units could be quite handy just to hold the fort, while more high investment units go out to beat down the enemy. Next up, we've got the Gladiator tanks, the units that I'd rate as perhaps the most efficient of the Space Marine tank line right now. They have had a crazy amount of fairly decent points cuts since the unit first came out, and are now getting to the point where they're genuinely quite good for damage and defense. Out of the three of them, I'd probably prefer the anti-infantry Reaper one maybe, particularly if you're in a Devastator Doctrine chapter, where all those mass shots are going to be AP -2 all game long. The anti-tank of the Valiant is alright as well, but maybe not quite a standout with all the melter platforms that Space Marines can get. I still think that these guys struggle a little bit compared with core options, but one or two of them really don't seem like they'd hurt the battle line all that much, and could be okay to use with a Tech Marine or something. Lastly, for the upper section of Tier 2, here we've got the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought. This is the Forge World datasheet, and again I thought I'd mention it just as it's a particularly standout one. This one gets core firepower, and perhaps the most common loadout for it are the dual Volkite Culverins plus the Cyclone missiles on top, and then ideally in Devastator Doctrine all game long to give those general purpose Culverins AP -1. For the points cost, it's not super tough to return attacks, and it also costs a command point to field as well, but in general it's really quite reliable firepower and can get a lot of the best buffs that the chapters can give them. I feel like it's particularly stand out in Iron Hands who want the Devastator Doctrine, give it some rerolls, and you can make one of them a character so it doesn't get shot back directly, quite a powerful option. Finally, moving up into the really good stuff, here I've split Tier 1 again into an upper and lower half, all of which though I think are very competitive Space Marine units right now, strong datasheets that I'd expect to come up pretty regularly in top army lists. First up we've got the Aggressors. They're perhaps one of the biggest winners of the Arcs of Omen update, dropped all the way down to 30 points even with the Boltstorm gauntlets, and are both at least reasonably tough with 3 wounds at toughness 5, and just very dangerous to anything that gets too close to them, massive anti-infantry shooting, backed up by a decent amount of melee with power fists. If they can get a convincing turn of damage dealing against the enemy, they're in for a good time. Quite a lot of chapters get on well with them as well. Salamanders all love their Flamestorm gauntlets. They tend to work quite well with Ultramarines buffing characters with both range and melee profiles. White Scars can advance shoot and charge with no penalty, and Imperial Fists all quite like their bolters. Definitely a very strong datasheet at the moment, I think. I'd probably rank them towards the top of this section. I wouldn't have been against putting them in the upper tier of Tier 1. Next up, we've got Space Marine Scouts on the Landspeeder Storm, another unit that won out massively in the update. They gained a cheaper scout squad with a whole load of free war gear, including a Thunderhammer plus Combi Melter on the Sergeant if you want it, plus sniper rifles and a heavy weapon, and you get all of that moving around in a very fast Landspeeder Storm that's only 50 points, making them pretty annoying nuisance units to be jumping onto objectives and fighting over them. They can fire out of the transport if they don't want to disembark, or they can get out of the transport after it's moved if they need to do an action or take an objective or something. It can be pretty nice in Iron Hands where they get the rerolls of one with all their heavy weapons, or maybe Space Wolves as well, where they can get different interesting options like extra power weapons or take a melter gun. For 110 points, it really is quite an irritating unit to deal with. Transports can just be a bit problematic to take down, as even if you gun down the Landspeeder Storm, the scouts might get out behind terrain or something, and still be in a good position to take objectives or deal a bit of damage next turn. I think even starting on the board they're not too bad. 60 points to claim an objective early is fine. Competing for that role though, there's the Incursors, very cheap for deployment at just 18 points per model now, and with their combat blades they get a bit of extra melee threat with AP -1. They get the Haywire Mine built in for free now, so that can deal a bit of mortal wound damage to enemies trying to charge them. They are quite nice for combat chapters like Blood Angels for example, where an early game charge with a whole bunch of AP -1 can actually be genuinely threatening. They are competing with the Infiltrators, which do seem to be the go-to Primaris troops choice these days, but I feel like these guys are still good and a bit cheaper as well. Next up we've got the Sternguard Veteran Squad, 100 points for a whole load of Melter Death on standard 2 wound Space Marines. For that cost you can get 2 multi-melters and 3 combi melters, really quite a murderous unit there, maybe jumping out of a drop pod or a rhino or something. Armies like Salamanders are really going to love those with the +1 to wound when they get into Tactical Doctrine. I would still probably rate them towards the lower end of this tier though. Devastators might just outcompete them by a little I feel. Speaking of which, Devastators got free gear in Arcs of Omen, so 115 points, including the Cherub and a bunch of las cannons and grav cannons, and the multi-melters are still very efficient despite having to pay a 10-point upgrade cost. Mixed loadouts can actually be quite good for the Devastators with the Sigma and Armorium Cherub, so you could choose to focus on a grav cannon if you need to kill infantry, or a multi-melter or las cannon if you wanted to take down a tank. They could definitely jump into a drop pod if desired. Iron Hands in particular get on well with that, seeing as they get to ignore the heavy weapon penalty and get rerolls. But at the cost they're at, I think that starting on the board really isn't bad either. They're particularly nice in the Space Wolves, who can get their Long Fang variant of them, take them alongside a Wolfguard pack leader to get a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, plus a Cyclone missile launcher for a very, very dangerous model for just an extra 30 odd points. Next up, we've got the Assault Squad, fast moving, skirmishy melee infantry, usually packing a couple of plasma pistols, an eviscerator, and some fancy gear on the sergeant. I think they're quite an interesting unit as a skirmishing squad to jump from objective to objective and deal a solid amount of damage to any enemy infantry on them. They're also infantry for doing actions and have got fast movements to get from place to place. They're a particularly interesting choice for Space Wolves and Blood Angels, perhaps. Both of those can get a bit of different variant war gear compared with the standard squad and make them yet more threatening. In the heavy support section, the Eliminators are a nice cheap 3 model squad for 75 points. You can forward deploy them on midfield objectives and things, again to get actions and things going early if you like, and for the points cost they are quite hard to kill in cover, with their camo cloaks effectively giving them a 1+ save in light cover. They can provide a little bit of sniping fire with their damage to sniper rifles, or chip in with a fairly threatening bit of anti-tank fire with the last fusils hitting on 2s, and a lot of competitive lists quite like to use them with the Instigator Bolt Carbine. That's the sergeant gun that allows the squads to move, shoot, move, allowing them to cover really quite a remarkable amount of distance in one turn, or just pop in and out of cover, taking pot shots at the enemy while not being shot back. Really not bad as a utility unit to take maybe 1 or 2 copies of. Next up, we've got the Vanguard Veterans. If you want a combat unit that moves fast in the Space Marine Codex, then these guys are generally it. The jump packs are really nice, and you can take Storm Shields for an extra 5 points as well to give them some pretty decent defense. I would take those in absence of Armor of Contempt now. Otherwise, they do have a fair few loadouts that are really quite good. Power weapons now they're free, Lightning Claws or heavier hitters like Thunderhammers are all absolutely fine. Now the Relic Blade for the Sergeant is completely free as well. I will be tempted to take that. In general, I think they're a pretty solid unit for putting any melee buffs on. Really quite handy for bounding across the board. Maybe particularly nice in chapters like White Scars with mass damage 1 attacks, which they can make mass damage 2 if they're in their assault doctrine. Next up, I've chosen to rank the Redemptor Dreadnought and its new variant cousin, the Brutalis Dreadnought here. Redemptors, I think, remain a very solid staple unit, generalist firepower with the big macroplasma, the Onslaught Gatling cannons, and some Icarus and Stormbolter shots. Those upgrades now free. They're a big chunky core unit that's got some okay defense and operate quite well as a Dreadnought castle. They can take rerolls very nicely, plus a bunch of other character buffs, and if anything can give them a 5+ invul save, like say either Black Templars or maybe a Librarian Psychic Fortress or a Deathwatch relic. All of that is good news for them. The Brutalis Dreadnought hasn't been out for too long, so it's a bit of an early take to rank it here, I'd say. On paper at least, though, it does look like it's got pretty comparable threats to the Redemptor. The shooting isn't quite as good for the points, but it does have a massive amount of combat threats with those Brutalis claws. There's very little that it charges into that wouldn't have a decent amount of damage dealt to it. I would probably rank the Brutalis a little bit lower than the Redemptor. I feel like part of the reason the Redemptor's quite good is that it can just be a bit more of a backfield unit and only contribute to melee when it needs to, whereas the Brutalis needs to move forward if you're going to get good value out of it. Space Marine HQ's next, and I have just chosen to rank basically the entire HQ section in this tier. I feel like literally every one of these options can be pretty competitive in the right chapter, and it depends what sort of units that you're buffing. Captains and lieutenants are both nice, cheap and effective bringers of rerolls. Probably the most common ones I'd be tempted to take would be nice and fast moving infantry with the jump pack. That can allow them to keep up with assault units and get their buffs where they need to go. Or maybe a bit more ground based and tanky variants, things like the options with the Storm Shield and Mastercrafted Power Swords, like the Blade Guard variants from Indomitus. In particular, I think that the 65-point Primaris Lieutenant there is really quite good at the moment, really quite tough, and brings those rerolls and a character to bear warlord traits and relics for cheap. If you are taking a captain, I would be fairly tempted to upgrade it to a chapter master if you do have some decent core targets. 4 rerolls to hit flexed onto the unit that's most important each turn is really big. You could use it on shooting units early in the game and then put it on melee units as they're getting stuck in. Otherwise, I think that the other Space Marine character choices really are quite balanced. It will vary quite a bit though, depending on exactly what units you're supporting and which chapter that you're coming from. Tech Marines are kind of obvious. If you've got lots of vehicles that hit on a 3 plus, usually going to be worth it, particularly alongside Dreadnought castles. The Master of the Forge isn't a terrible upgrade to heal 3 wounds per turn as well. Librarians are quite nice for that Psychic Fortress 5 plus invul save. That's become a lot more relevant again now Armour of Contempt went away, but otherwise can be kind of dependent on what chapter's psychic powers you're taking. Some chapters like Dark Angels, Space Wolves, or Death Watch have some particularly standout ones, others like maybe Raven Guard or Imperial Fists less so. Finally, chaplains I feel like can almost always have a role if you want them, maybe a little bit more high investment, as I think you'd usually want the Master of Sanctity plus Wise Orator to get 2 litanies out of them on a 2 plus. Just about every litany that they can have is usable though, buffing damage at range or melee, getting mortal wound protection, extra charge range, or even just turning the chaplain himself into a melee monster with Mantra of Strength, plus the Benediction of Fury relic. The on foot and on bike ones I think are quite well balanced as well. You get extra speed and durability, but it does cost a whole load more points to get it. Finally, for the strong Space Marine characters, we've also got the Apothecary here as well. Definitely a staple for a whole load of chapters. He allows you to get a Feel No Pain type save on nearby units, heal units that have been injured but not killed, but perhaps most importantly use that combat revival stratagem. 1 command point to set up a slain model from the dead, potentially towards the enemy units to get shorter charge ranges if it matters. The Chief Apothecary and Selfless Healer are quite a tried and tested combo to be able to do that without paying any command points, and there are a whole load of good targets out there in the Space Marine army. Things like Terminators, Gravis Armor, and Attack Bikes are all great, as are Centurions if you're using them. Blood Angels and Dark Angels take these guys to the next level, having their on-bike and jump pack Sanguinary Priest ones, which get the buffs exactly where they need to be. Finally, for perhaps some of the most standout units even within Tier 1, I feel like just for raw datasheet strength, these guys are perhaps some of the best. First up, we have the Primaris Infiltrators, who really seem to be a massive competitive staple for the majority of chapters in Arcs of Omen. A couple of units of Infiltrators seems to be the stock troops choice these days. They're only 20 points per model, you can forward deploy them, they've got that enormous deep strike denial bubble as well, which is very relevant now strategic reserves are more common, and also with certain other armies being kind of strong, things like Demons and Genestealer Cult really won't like to see these on the board. For that reason, they can be quite handy just to defend a home field objective as well. You can pretty much guarantee you're not going to get charged out of deep strike with these. On top of that, their Helix Gauntlets to ignore a failed save each turn can be really big. If that nullifies a shot that was going to kill an entire infiltrator, it's almost like you've got 6 models in the unit. And if you get to use it for multiple turns, then even better. Like the other Phobos, they've got a -1 to hit stratagem with their Smoke Bomb and Transhuman Physiology. They can be very, very tough if they need to be, and that's really nice for midfield objectives where often the only goal is to survive. All of this is kind of balanced with their damage output being pretty low, only really good at bullying light infantry, but auto-wounding bolters also aren't nothing. They're definitely a massive competitive staple these days. Next up, just for another very, very efficient unit out of Codex Space Marines, we've got the Terminator Assault Squad. 33-point models with Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. These guys just kind of won very, very hard out of the points updates, not caring about the loss of Armour of Contempt, but also dropping 10 points cheaper than they were, and they weren't terrible to start with. A whole flurry of Strength 8 and Damage 3 melee attacks is going to worry just about anything that they can touch in combat, and if they need an extra burst of melee power, then you can get +1 to hit with Fury of the First for 1 CP. With their 2+ save and a +1 from the Storm Shield, I'd argue that they're perhaps one of the best defensive anvil units in the whole Codex, particularly if you can get one in light cover as well for even higher saving throws. Lots of chapters have good synergies with them. Black Templar can put Relic Bearers on them, Dark Angel's Deathwing can make them absolutely stand out, and their unique datasheet can give them some Cyclone Missile Launchers and the Watcher in the Dark. Space Wolves can also mix Cyclone Missile Launchers and Thunderhammers and Storm Shields. Iron Hands can give you a Feel No Pain type stratagem, and Salamanders have a few ways to make them even tougher, and they're quite good users of some of their powerful stratagems like shielding a unit behind them or countercharging the foe. They're pretty easy to support with other models as well, could be near to Rites of War for objective secured with all that, or maybe an Apothecary for some Feel No Pain and revivals. Overall, I feel like they're a unit that's kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Lots of Space Marine units are quite good at hiding than jumping out at killing things. These guys are perhaps some of the better ones at standing in the open when that's needed. Next up, I still think that there's massive value in the Eradicator squad these days. Their points changes in Arcs of Omen were for heavy melter rifles and the multi-melter to be gone free, but also I think that they were big winners out of the whole strategic reserve change. You can throw them in there for free now, and against just about any list with a few hard targets, the ability of these guys to turn up on the flanks and be hitting the enemy with crazy d6 plus 4 damage is really quite intimidating. Probably not a unit that you want to go absolutely mad on, but just one or two units like that I think can really be disruptive. Salamanders love the +1 to wound with the melter. Iron Hands like any infantry moving around with heavy weapons. Can be interesting for Ultramarines starting on the board as well, again moving and firing without penalty. Finally, for another couple of staple units that I think are quite easy choices to pick up in the army are attack bikes with multi-melters and land speeders who are usually equipped with a multi-melter and assault cannon using their tornado variant at the moment. Both of these are just really nice, cheap little fast movers with some multi-melters that they don't have to pay more points for anymore. Depending on the enemy and how much they can bring to bear on them, they can either be used just as extra damage to put some melter shots where they're most needed, but perhaps more commonly just use their really quite good movements to jump themselves forward onto objectives and be quite nice expendable trading units where the enemy might have to go out and deal with them. Then you lose something like a 50-point attack bike or 70-point land speeder and hopefully delete the enemy unit back in return. Again, like the Eradicators, I think they're very, very good for their role, though I wouldn't take too many of them in most chapters. Again, with melter weapons, particularly nice for Salamanders, though I'd say maybe the most standout out of any of them will be Dark Angel's Ravenwing. The 5+ invuls with Jink, plus the core synergies that they can have with attack bikes are really quite impressive, pre-game moving and character buffs and things. Really nice units for helping win the mission, as well as being efficient damage dealer units as well. So anyway, that just about brings us to the end of our look through the Codex Space Marine units and some of the ones that I think are stronger or weaker right now. Looking forward to hearing your guys' takes on things as always. I know that these tier lists can often be a little bit arbitrary. If there's anything that you think that I've ranked too high or too low, look forward to hearing about it down below in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description as well. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.